Okay, so welcome to this special session of the Ontario Community Connect group. This evening we have a special guest speaker, Dylan Patterson, who's going to talk about how growing up with a primary immunodeficiency impacted her experiences at school and university, how she managed to cope with this, and how she managed to overcome what some people might view as limitations. So this talk was originally presented as part of a special panel on patient experiences in public spaces at the British Columbia Education and Awareness Day in 2024. Now, behind this was the idea that primary immunodeficiency is more than just a set of symptoms, but can have an impact on all facets of a person's life, including both social and environmental interactions. So I'm going to give a very brief introduction to Dylan, whose pronouns are she, her, and who was diagnosed with common variable immunodeficiency at age 25. She works as a registered clinical counsellor and is passionate advocate for mental health and wellness accessibility. She enjoys traveling, eating good food, and spending time with her dog, Stanley. So, Dylan, welcome, and I'm going to hand over the control of the Zoom screen to you and close myself off.
Okay, thank you very much. Hi, everyone. My name is Dylan. It's an honor and a privilege to be here today, sharing my experience with you as a person living with primary immunodeficiency disorder and my journey through education. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I am presenting to you today on the stolen land of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations, a place where I am grateful to live, work, and play. So let me tell you a little more about me. I was diagnosed with a primary immunodeficiency disorder at age 25. This means that I went through elementary school, high school, and my undergrad without having a diagnosis. I then went on to complete a Master of Counseling Psychology degree at Adler University in the fall of 2020. And I have to say that starting grad school as a person living with PI during a global pandemic was interesting, but we'll get to that later. I now work as a registered clinical counselor at 2 different private practices in the Lower Mainland of BC. Many of you here, whether you live with primary immunodeficiency or you love someone who lives with PI, know that PI is an umbrella term for many different disorders that fall into that category. My particular vintage is a 1992 hypogamma-immunoglobulinemia, which in short means that my body does not produce antibodies to fight off infection. My experience has been characterized by recurrent lung and sinus infections, many of which before receiving my diagnosis and beginning treatment lasted weeks and often months and were marked by high fevers and extreme fatigue. That photo of me as a baby wrapped in a cold towel is one of those instances of fever. I will say that I have a bit of imposter syndrome presenting before you today. I often wonder if my experience is as bad as others with the same diagnosis, as I've been lucky to have avoided serious complications or hospitalizations, and I've always excelled academically. And I know that it's not necessarily helpful to compare myself to others. My experience is my experience. However, I do often wonder what my life would have looked like had I had more information about how to best support myself earlier in life, as my perspective is through the lens of someone who is diagnosed in adulthood. My slides are out of order here. Apologies. What stands out to me most in reflecting on my early schooling is always having a cough. That was my baseline. At some point, after many doctor's appointments and a trip to nuclear medicine, I was diagnosed with asthma. My parents will attest to the fact that I was always a strong-willed child. I didn't believe that I had asthma, so I rarely used my inhalers. I was still a physically, socially, and academically active child. I would swim for hours. I played on all the school sports teams. I did ballet and was involved with musical theater. So I have particularly fond memories associated with my early schooling. And sure, there were times when I think about how terrifying my fevers were. It was not uncommon for me to experience auditory and visual hallucinations. There's one particular instance that I remember being off sick from school for about 2 weeks, a very long time for a precocious 7-year-old to be away from school and friends. I don't remember ever feeling behind when I returned to school, but I do remember feeling really sad that I had missed out on so much learning. I loved school. I loved my friends, my teachers. I loved writing and problem solving and taking tests and drawing and playing sports and singing. So for me, being away from school was like being separated from my life. High school was a little less rosy. I remember starting to notice feeling exceptionally tired around the time when I was 15 or so. Again, I have a distinct memory of a time when I came back from traveling just as the H1N1 flu pandemic was ramping up. People noticed how sick I was, and at one point, a younger student came up to me and shouted swine flu, which was incredibly embarrassing. I remember making the decision to not go to the doctor because I felt ashamed and was also like, what's the point? I'm always sick anyway. Throughout high school, I remember feeling like I couldn't do certain things that required quiet. For instance, going to a movie theater with friends, based on how bad my cough was at the time. My teacher started to notice changes in me. I stopped attending classes. I lived across the street from my high school, so much to my parents and my teachers' chagrin, I would attend the classes that I thought were important and go back home to hang out with friends and nap. I usually tried to negotiate with my teachers to allow me to do the work self-directed at home, and I would submit a portfolio of assignments near the end of the semester. Luckily, my teachers were as accommodating as they could be at the time. I was on an accelerated education plan, which meant that my course load decreased in grades 11 and grade 12. It was a slow march, but I made it through. My plans to fly the coop and study psychology at the University of Victoria, the driving force. In the summer between graduating high school and beginning university, I went to Montreal to do a language exchange program. Almost immediately upon my arrival, I noticed symptoms of a sinus infection. Near the end of my time there, I was so sick that I asked my parents if I could come home early. I remember laying on the floor in the hallway of the University of Montreal, fatigued and feverish, wondering how I was going to make it through the verbal portion of my final exam. Again, somehow I made it through. I would like to say that my experience shifted once I started my first semester at the University of Victoria. Unfortunately, I became so ill that I could barely get myself to class. It was the first time that my grades were impacted by my health. I ended up returning home and taking courses at Douglas College to reset and ease the stress and pressure I had put on myself to be academically successful. I ended up transferring to SFU, and again, I have a distinct memory of that time marked by illness. The first and only time I reached out to a professor, I asked if I could sit the exam in another room due to my cough being so loud and consistent that it drew undue attention to me. I ended up being later diagnosed with pneumonia, but at the time I was just embarrassed by my cough. I also remember taking a health psychology class and learning about psychoneuroimmunology, which is essentially the intersection of psychology and immunology, and thinking, hey, this kind of fits my experience. I wonder how stress impacts my health. Because without fail, after each exam period, I would invariably become sick. Again, by sheer determination, I made it through and ended up with a Bachelor of Arts with distinction, majoring in psychology. After I graduated from university, I finally had more time and energy to think about why I was getting sick all the time. I did some research and found an immunology program based out of UBC, and I asked my GP to refer me for testing. The words I remember hearing were, "What makes you think you have an immune issue?" I was a little stunned in that moment and can't quite remember how I responded, but what I did know was that I was sick and tired of being sick and tired. Again, I want to share that I understand myself as a strong-willed person. However, when I did advocate for myself, it felt as though I was somehow making things up or exaggerating my symptoms. Lo and behold, I ended up seeing an immunologist and was diagnosed with CVID, or common variable immune disorder, specifically hypogamma immunoglobulinemia, 17 letters long. Learning that was overwhelming. I knew that I was always sick and looking for answers, but grappling with the reality of a diagnosis and adjusting to the idea of self-administering a life course immunoreplacement therapy was emotional, to say the least. I was shocked, overwhelmed, confused, sad, angry, relieved, validated. I wondered how this thing that I could now clearly point to had gone so long without being properly assessed. Unfortunately, I started to understand myself in terms of limitations. There were things that I could do and things that I could not do. Over the years, I had learned that traveling was risky as I became exceptionally ill whenever I did so. I didn't travel much during my 20s, and even though I had a dream of hiking through Europe after finishing my degree, I didn't think that it would be feasible to do that or work full time. At that point, I was working as an education assistant in a high school, and again was told by my doctor that being in a school was probably not the best environment for me to be in. I knew that I wanted to return to school for further education, but I didn't know how it would be possible. In 2019, my brother ended up challenging me to train for a marathon with my uncle, my auntie, and him. My immediate reaction was, no, I can't do that. My logic was that every time I went to the gym, I would get sick for weeks on end. I was in a state of hyper awareness of how the things I did impacted my health, because at that time I had to be. I'd missed all the signs and I missed all the signs that connected the dots between what I did and why I was sick for so long. What about a half marathon? He asked. I can't exactly pinpoint what it was that made me agree to his proposition, but I started training. In 2019, I ran the BMO half marathon. It was a huge accomplishment for me and the catalyst for a massive perspective shift. It gave me the confidence to travel again. I started taking prerequisite courses for the counseling program I had my eye on and eventually applied and was accepted into the program. As I mentioned earlier, I started my master's program in counseling psychology during the fall of 2020. There was so much uncertainty, and I was worried that if I became sick with COVID, that I would die. Our schooling was online, and while there was a complex range of emotions and perspectives about not getting to experience grad school in the way most of us had envisioned, I was grateful to feel safe. I self-advocated to access academic accommodations on an as-need basis. I had a formal letter that I submitted to each instructor at the beginning of the semester that communicated my needs. I felt validated, relieved, and empowered. Again, I wondered what my earlier schooling experiences would have looked like had I had access to my diagnosis sooner. Ironically, throughout 2020 and 2021, I experienced more stability in my health than ever before. I went a year without having any infections. I was sleeping better, my cough completely disappeared, and I had newfound energy. When we returned to masked in-person instruction, I was once again worried that I'd be left behind. That fear of being separated from my life reared its head again. I did end up getting COVID in the winter of 2022 and was able to access Paxlovid within 24 hours of my first symptoms. I count myself as very, very lucky to have not had serious symptoms or complications. I was worried though. I didn't know how I'd be able to complete my clinical practicum face to face with clients, and I ended up taking a leave of absence for 2 semesters until I felt comfortable moving forward. I eventually graduated in the fall of 2023 and began working in the spring of 2024. I'm grateful to have found myself in a career that is not only truly rewarding, but allows me to draw on my own experience with grief, uncertainty, anxiety, learning to access support, and learning to be self-compassionate. It's not lost on me that my unique identities have impacted my experience in a positive way. I'd be remiss to not acknowledge that many of the sociocultural locations that I occupy are ones of privilege. I want to round out this presentation by returning to one of my earliest memories of being sick during elementary school. As I was reflecting on what to share in this presentation and how to frame my experience, I remembered that I had kept some handmade get well cards from my grade 2 class. These are notes written by friends, classmates and their family members. And one cheeky little note that reads, Nishu loves you. It's no fun without you. I remember feeling so special receiving those cards. I felt like I was going to be forgotten having been away from school for so long. And of course, at that time, 7-year-old me didn't know that I would go through the years of being away from school for periods of time. And what I'd like to say to that little girl and every sick version of me who wondered how I would survive feeling as awful as I did is that you are well. You won't always feel so sick. You won't always feel so tired. You've learned how to understand your needs, to advocate strongly for yourself and others, and to support yourself in finding physical, emotional, and spiritual health and wellness. This path, although bumpy at times, leads to a place filled with community, connection, compassion, and love. Thank you to everyone for listening to my story, and a special thank you to my family members who are here supporting me today and every day. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Dylan. For sharing this really important part of your life growing up. I'm sure that many of you in the audience recognize and empathize with Dylan's story, particularly if you're family, obviously. And I'm sure we'd all like to give you a virtual round of applause if everyone wasn't muted. So now it's time for some questions.
How did it affect you as a child? You had ear infections, you had throat infections, you had fevers too, I guess.
Yeah, I had pretty extreme high fevers. I remember those experiences quite vividly. I mean, the cough was consistent, and even when I was complying with the doctor's instructions to take my puffers, it never seemed to kind of go away. It was just always there. So I just remember feeling tired all the time. Or maybe when I was younger, not necessarily noticing that I was maybe different from other kids, but certainly with that adult lens, looking back on things, noticing that that tiredness was always there. And then in terms of like the infections, just that chronic recurring kind of lung and sinus infection was just always there.
Thank you. Great presentation. I was, I think I was lucky because I got off a little easier than you. I had sort of some strange symptoms and a cough, but it sounds like it was much less intense than yours. So I wasn't diagnosed till my late 50s, early 60s. But it was really interesting to hear your story. And you mentioned that even though you consider yourself to be confident and strong, you felt like you were exaggerating when you were asked about to describe your symptoms to your doctor. Was that because was that something that was caused by the doctor, or was that just you feeling uncertain, or like what do you think the basis for that was?
It's a good question. I mean, I think about this like when I was younger, but then also like as I continue to kind of move through the medical system, just this kind of idea that if we're bringing in really ideas or our own research, sometimes it's dismissed. And again, it's one of those things where it's kind of like, um, particularly with respect to primary immunodeficiency, I think the way that doctors approach things just as a in family practice or interacting with a GP is again, it's kind of like the most common explanation is the most likely, and for our case, that's not always the case with us. And so I think that there's like definitely a power differential that exists between doctors and patients. And yet, as like a 20-something-year-old, I didn't know that I had an immune issue, but I was like, hey, like, can we look into this? Because I'm just so sick all the time. So I think that's kind of like where it comes from, is like kind of maybe expecting to not be believed in some ways. Yeah, that would be kind of my response to that.
Have you overcome that since?
No. No, it's an ongoing process. I feel like it's just like as I learn to advocate for myself, I, have to have these kind of conversations that like the things that I'm experiencing are real and valid, and it's a lot easier to maybe offer that support to someone else rather than yourself. So I think that's just kind of like an ongoing thing for me personally to learn.
Keep working on it, because you deserve to be confident in advocating for yourself.
Thank you.
Mhm. I relate to your story, and it's, for me, it's kind of comforting to hear kind of similar situation that you've experienced, you know. I find it very helpful.
It's
Looks like,
definitely a common experience, I think.
yeah. So the schools were not too accommodating till you got into the higher university levels. I think they're better now, hopefully.
Yeah, I think they are. Again, I think it was me going into grad school having that kind of like diagnosis to kind of like, in some ways, just
Mhm.
bring clarity to some of the ways in which my energy levels would fluctuate with like that amount of work that I was doing. And
Mhm.
so having some kind of like evidence, I guess, in some way to substantiate my experience was helpful in just kind of like having um, an accommodation letter that I could use as needed. And sometimes I didn't use it at all, but it also was, I was in smaller seminars and had more personal relationships with instructors. And so that definitely helped. Um, During my undergrad, there wasn't really that opportunity to do that.
So did it affect your social life, I guess, as a child, didn't it?
I mean,
Finding,
I would say that with like being away from school for large periods of time, I think that I felt like I was being, left out or being left behind. But I wouldn't say that it had kind of like a direct impact. It didn't limit me in terms of the quality of my friendships or anything like that.
that's,
Um, yeah, yeah. That's why I say I feel very lucky and I feel very grateful. And that's kind of part of the reason why I, often wonder if my experience is, as bad. Again, there's that comparison thing, but it's, I've heard people who have had very different experiences. So
yeah. So it's good you're advocating, Dylan. Get the information out there.
what do you think might have changed at school if you'd been given an earlier diagnosis? What accommodations would you have liked to have had? It's hard for me to say with elementary school because again, I never felt behind like academically, but certainly in high school, if I'd had again more kind of like flexibility around around um, when assignments were due, that was something that I just ended up negotiating on my own. But again, I think it's helpful to have those things kind of in a formal document so that it's less emotional labor every time, something comes up and you have to kind of advocate for yourself. It's just something nice to have in your back pocket.
Mhm. There's a question here, Dylan. They asked, who at university have you disclosed your PI to, and what motivated you to do that? How did you approach it? What was the outcome? Favorable, I hope.
Yeah, so during grad school, because it was COVID and just based on the nature of the program, I, kind of decided who I felt safe disclosing to. So my friends in the program, obviously my instructors, people who were kind of assisting with the accommodation I had to disclose to. I remember it being scarier at first, again, because it was kind of the first time that I ever sought out like a formal accommodation. But I definitely had the support of like my peers and and friends to support me kind of along that.
Mhm.
Um, and in terms of like what motivated me to do it, I think just wanting to again have that greater flexibility for myself. Um, as we know, stress impacts our levels of health and wellness, and so I mean that was just a very challenging time. regardless of being in school. And so I wanted to kind of just, I guess, safeguard my way through that program. Yeah.
And it's validation. Another question here, they're curious as to whether any of your teachers picked up on your repeated infections.
Yeah, so I don't remember anyone noticing it, because again, I wasn't necessarily showing the signs in a lot of ways. Like I was sick, but I was still performing at a high level, and I was happy and active. So it wasn't necessarily kind of showing up in those aspects. It's like, okay, well, maybe she does just have a cough all the time. Yeah.
Another question just arose here. It sounds like it's important to raise awareness with the teachers as well as physicians and the medical community. Yeah,
I would say so. I would say so. I mean, we spend a lot of time in a schooling context. Yeah, and I think maybe there's more likelihood of like a dialogue happening around that nowadays, just with the way that things have kind of shifted. So certainly greater awareness, you know, as these things kind of like show up in the schooling system, could make it easier for maybe teachers to flag things. But again, it is also kind of like a tricky thing talking about someone's personal medical or health information.
I think that's good. Thank you, Dylan, for that cavalcade of questions and for a really, really good presentation.